Today I want to talk about East African trade and Chinese porcelain. It's no secret the Middle East, in Turkey and Iran, they had enormous fondness for Chinese porcelain beginning in the Yuan dynasty when the Mongols opened up trade, and all of that material, much of that material, is still available in the Topkapi Museum in Turkey and the Archaeological Shrine in Iran. And they were also held in very high esteem within the Arab communities in East Africa, not only the Middle East, but further down the coast in East Africa, in the area known as Swahili, or the Swahili coast, which was a fairly large area, around 500 kilometers long, running down the East African coast. And this was all part of the trade system that had been set up during the 8th century, during the Tang dynasty, between the Philippines, the Spice Islands, India, and all that trade that could be going on in the Indian Ocean, ships going back and forth. And this was long before the Europeans came. This was long before they arrived. And much of this area today includes the shores of, in East Africa, includes the shores of Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and that region, and all of the islands, including Madagascar and Zanzibar and so forth. It was an absolute hub of activity. And the earliest glazewares uncovered by archaeologists were traded to East Africa from Islamic cities around the Persian Gulf. That was where it first began. And then later, Chinese ceramics and black glass beads, as well as textiles, were bartered and exchanged for numerous high-value East African commodities like ivory, tortoiseshell, ambergris, rock crystal, timber, copper, gold, and silver, as well as exotic animals and birds. This was how the trade all got going between the Middle East and the East African coast, because they were all Muslims. It was a giant Muslim community. And one of the things they found was that in the 9th century, they realized, archaeologists, in the Shanga site, which is in East Africa near the Pate Island, they discovered 20 Shangsha or Tang Dynasty shards buried in the ground, which was rather shocking because they didn't think that they were there that early. And they weren't. They actually weren't trading directly with China at that point, but the pieces were making it there through assorted trade routes, being traded from ship to ship to ship, and worked their way down the coast. And it's an interesting dynamic, if you're familiar with it, because this was before the Europeans came. This was early on. Chinese archaeological teams working in India, for example, have recorded large Longquan green glazed stoneware celadons that were just as good as the ones that they were shipping into the Middle East, just as good as the ones that were being sent to the court for the imperial family. These were also finding their way over time down into the east coast of Africa. The earliest available archaeological evidence shows that there was almost no true direct contact between the Chinese and East Africa up until the Ming Dynasty. Prior to that, everything got there through sort of circuitous routes. They sort of went from India to Sudan, and then down and down, and after passing through many ports, would eventually arrive on the east coast of Africa, where the items would be traded for goods there and then sent back. As early as the 13th century, Chinese ceramics, they know, were used in the Swahili coast and built into the facades of buildings like tiles. They would inlay them into the cement on the outsides of these buildings, of domes and so forth, and they were used in burial monuments and burial tombs and so forth that were reserved for the families of the very, very elite, members of very wealthy trading families predominantly. Most of the wealthiest families in these cities, and there were many cities up and down this 500-mile stretch that had extremely wealthy merchant families that were involved with trade, involved with ivory trade, slave trade, and they built massive homes, very elaborate homes made of stone, not of wood, but of stone, beautifully decorated, high arch ceilings, and very much in the Muslim taste, very much in the Muslim tradition with arches and so forth. And they were the ones who controlled all the trade. They controlled the maritime trade. And to this day, you can still, there are still places in that part of the world, in the east coast of Africa where you can find 16th and 17th century dishes built into things. One of the most famous is the great pillar at the Mabrui Cemetery in Kenya. It's still there. They haven't been looted yet. A lot of them were looted. A lot of them were looted over the years, obviously, as the economy there shifted and went into a downturn. Objects of value naturally get taken out and sold, and they move out of the area. So there's very little Chinese porcelain left there today, but there is still some. And over time, Chinese and Middle Eastern porcelain was considered back then one of the most desirable possessions, not only because of its great value and its demand in the European markets, but down there because it was very difficult to obtain and was considered to be an enormous status symbol because of it was a symbol of old money. It was a symbol of wealth. It was a symbol of influence, and because you couldn't buy porcelain in the stores, they didn't have auctions in East Africa the way they did in Europe, for example, when porcelains were brought back by the Dutch East India Company or the East India Company of England. They didn't have those auctions. They didn't unload a ship and start selling off all the porcelains. The porcelains were sent as tribute and as payment to the local sultanates and the people in charge. All right, and this was how the only way you could really get porcelain. So it made them incredibly popular. People want what they can't get, and the only way you could really get them was through a middleman, or if you knew somebody that had one and they were willing to sell it to you. And then later it became an issue because people were looting graves. They were stealing them off of the graves and tombs. And they know some of this because a lot of the looting, most of the looting took place, the bulk of it took place during the 1800s. And they have photographs were taken. There was a British photographer, an archaeologist who went over there, and he photographed many of the buildings and the interiors, like you're seeing here, how these porcelains were displayed on walls, outsides of buildings, and you have these rooms with niches in them. And these photographs were the only records left displaying any of these, and these are in an archive up in Scotland. But they were all displaying the wealth and power of upper-class Swahili families who were fantastically wealthy by any standard in the world, by European standards or any place else. These people made vast fortunes trading. And Chinese trade ceramics were highly significant along the East African coast in a similar fashion to how they were used in Europe, except that they couldn't be bought. But they had enormous social influence upon people that would go to a home and see it, and they'd say, the person is cultured, he's wealthy, he owns these porcelains, very, very nice. And it was like having expensive cars parked in your driveway and a great painting hanging on your wall these days. When you have a visitor, they go, oh, he's got a Picasso, that kind of thing. So it signified significant social acceptance and belonging, and it meant you were the member of a very, very elite class if you owned porcelain. As a matter of fact, if you were getting married, one of the great honors would be to be fed your wedding dinner, your bride and the groom, to eat off of a porcelain plate from China. That was considered to be the ultimate in luxury, was eating off of a porcelain plate. And they were a symbol of mercantile power because, as I said, most of the people of great wealth along the East African coast were involved in maritime trade, shipping things out of the country, everything from people to ivory to spices to cloves, you name it. And they've done a lot of digging. They've done a lot of archaeological work in the last 50 years. And the ubiquity of Chinese porcelain and other precious stonewares recovered in these archaeological sites has unfortunately initially created a rather narrow and misperception about what they were trading in at the time, because the only thing left from all this trade until they found written records was the porcelain, because porcelain and pottery lasts a long time buried in the ground, even as shards. They could find them. And originally the archaeologists were under the impression that the only thing they really traded was porcelain, and they didn't realize that porcelain was just symbol of the wealth that was garnered. Only about 2 or 3% of the trade was actually involved porcelain and ceramics. And what they failed to understand was all of that was the porcelain was just a symbol and the result of an extensive ivory trade into India, extensive iron trade. They shipped a lot of iron to India because the East African iron was extremely durable, easy to work with, and was in high demand in India. And as well as spices, cloves, and so forth. And all of this was powered by non-Muslim slaves. You couldn't enslave a Muslim on the east coast of Africa. Only non-Muslims could be enslaved. And it's interesting because if the slave converted to Islam, he would almost be immediately freed. Maybe held on to for a little bit longer for some financial reason or for some legal reason, but it was a guarantee of being released from your bonds. And surprisingly, a lot of African inner Africans who were not Muslims wouldn't convert. They wouldn't do it because they had their own religious beliefs, their own faith, and a lot of them just died. A lot of them were once they were sort of used up on the east coast of Africa, the Muslim traders, the African Muslim traders, would sell them to the Middle East, and half of them died just trying to walk up there because they marched them across the Sudan and up into the Middle East, where they would be sold as they brought new slaves into the east coast of Africa. Because once slaves got a little bit old and long in the tooth, they wanted to get them out of there, and they would try to sell them and recoup some money. So it was a horrific practice, and it went on for 1,000 years. It went on for a long time, much longer than before the Europeans got there. Most of the slave trading was going into the Middle East, North Africa, India, and that sort of thing, and that was where all that was going. But as a result, they had this overrepresentation because of the archaeological stuff, and what they found over time was, as I said at the beginning, they really were making their money with slaves hauling vast quantities of like Indian ivory out, cloves, ivory. They were weaving silks. They were getting silk from China eventually, and they would weave it onto cotton foundations for objects to sell, and then they would trade those goods up into the Middle East and back to India and so forth. And it was all part of this swirling, never-ending flow of ships going around the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea before the Europeans arrived and after the Europeans arrived. And the volumes of trade increased in particular between the 10th and the 14th century, in particular in favor of, when it came to ceramics, Chinese ceramics, because they had the East Africans developed an enormous appreciation for the material because of its inherent superior quality over Middle Eastern pottery, over Indian stoneware, glazed wares, and so forth. They were even getting pottery from Thailand and Indonesia. But Chinese pottery or porcelain eventually became the absolute most preferred of all of them because it was just of such amazing quality, hardness, and beauty. And they would build in Swahili. The wealthy families would build an inner sanctum in the house called the vadaka, and this was a room with along a wall you'd see all these arches. The way you do in Muslim architecture, and they would put within them vases and bowls and plates and things to display as a further symbol. The fact that they have a vidaka in a giant stone house is pretty much a big status thing to begin with. But then when you threw Chinese porcelain into the mix as part of the decoration, it really boosted and elevated their status. And status in East Africa was just as important as it was in India, and just as important it was throughout the Middle East. Status and representations of status and wealth have, for thousands of years been considered to be the goal, that you wanted to be an important person in your community. And in East Africa, Chinese porcelain became one of the great symbols of wealth, power, influence, and so forth, and it was good for your family. It opened doors and so forth, and they had Chinese bowls and plates, and they would even mix with them sometimes very fine Islamic bronzes, and other items from other communities. But it was primarily focused around Chinese porcelain, and the status of a Swahili house was all based on about ownership of land, ships, how big your house was, all right, and the value of the house's contents and so forth. And it was a the local culture, so that the daughters often inherited the houses, which was always an interesting flip. So the daughters would often inherit their parents' homes where they could live and be secure. And they used the families, when their daughter had a wedding, they would publicly display through exchanges of gifts and by the celebration itself porcelains and exotic objects, again, to reinforce the image of exceptional wealth and influence and power. And this sort of display went on for hundreds and hundreds of years. And eventually, as the economies there fell apart, the porcelains were taken away. Objects from the Middle East that had survived were returned back to the Middle East. All kinds of trade goods, and basically foreign traders, when they come in there, as the fortunes of the East Coast diminished, the British and the French and the Dutch and all the usual suspects and Middle Eastern traders stripped away all the symbols of wealth by either stealing it, looting it, that kind of thing, or just buying it outright because the people no longer had any wealth left. And that's sort of why it went the way it did. And today they are digging around in the ground trying to find archaeological evidence, because so little of it survived above ground in people's homes, in public institutions, and so forth. There's a few museums down there that have bits and pieces of it, but largely 99% of it, 99.9% of it is basically gone for now. And that's the sad truth of it. But it was a golden age for about 700 years. They had trade relations with the Dutch for a time, with the Portuguese for a time. They kicked the Portuguese out in about 1720. But groups came and went, just like they did in other parts of the world, where trading rights were given and trading rights were taken away. And the Swahili coastline did the same thing. Some ships were welcome from some countries, some weren't. There were a lot of politics involved, but it was a very interesting period, and I'm hoping that in time, as archaeological evidence becomes stronger and stronger, and records are found and things are discovered, because it's sort of still a troubled part of the world today, as we all know, the Somali coast and all that. But hopefully in time, the archaeologists and scientists will get in there, and they'll be able to create a more formal picture of what it was really like. I would love to see some indications of more precisely how things were traded, what kind of buildings did they use, what kind of ships were they using, and who were all the major players, because they really don't know at this point who they all were. They have some names of famous ones, famous slave traders, famous ivory merchants, but they don't have a complete picture by a long shot yet, just because so little of it has survived, and they're going to be quite a while digging it all out. But when they do, I think it's going to be a very worthwhile story. All right, so that's the story of that. So check it out, and keep your eyes open. There may be more on it in the future, but I think it's just another facet to the interesting part of the story of Chinese and Asian art and trade, and how we all got to where we are today with it. All right, have a great rest of your week. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't so far, and I'll be back tomorrow with a regular weekly video. All right, bye-bye.